microscope in the lab that I worked at, it was too low on the bench, so to hold it up, we used this old veterinary parasitology book. It was not this big, it was the perfect height to prop that microscope up. And one day I decided to go ahead and take the microscope off that book and look at it. And there was a really interesting quote in there that I found, and I wanted to share that with the folks. After symptoms of homunculus, so that's the parasite that we're dealing with, we're going to do most of our discussion about today, have been seen, the time necessary for fattened lambs is greatly increased and requires the use of more expensive graze for finishing than non-parasitized lambs. So this is the key line here. The prime requisite of economical sheep production is raising of sheep that do not suffer from parasitism. At the time that this book was published, when you turn the page and go to the next page, the treatment that was recommended for sheep was black leaf 40. And it told you how to mix it up. It was basically a nicotine treatment that has been given to these animals to control parasitism. But most of these folks at this time were relying on the ability of the sheep to grow in spite of parasitism. So what happened shortly after this was the advent of all these fantastic drugs that really made production a lot easier for those folks, so they didn't have to place the emphasis on those particular traits. So the parasites that we're going to talk about in this particular talk today lie in what we call the Trichostrongylidae family, and it includes, but is not limited to, Trichostrongylis molibiformis, which lives in the small intestine, Cheilogrissagia circumcincta, which is the Abomasum cattle folks in the room. This is akin to Ostracadgia. So this is the same parasite, just a different name in different species. And then finally, Homunculus contortus. All three of these parasites experience the exact same life cycle. It's very simple, very not complex, like we see with coccidian parasites. So worms in this family have a very similar life cycle. Those ewes and lambs will be dropping eggs out onto the pasture. From the time that manure, that egg-laden manure hits the pasture, to the time that you get this infected L3 stage larvae is approximately 7 days under optimal conditions. Now, increase the heat, increase the humidity, those eggs can turn into larvae or infected larvae in a matter of 3 days. So common temperatures, 30 degrees Celsius, very, very high humidity that we create into our laboratory cultures. Typical 6 to 7 days those larvae come out. Those larvae migrate with dew on the grass up and down all day long. They're not big enough to really physically move themselves or inch up like a worm up the blade of grass. They will move with with capillary action and water moving up and down the grass. So when are sheep grazing? Morning, evening time, right? When's the dew highest on the grass? Same time they're grazing. So that's how those parasites are really getting into the sheep. And then the time from this infective stage larvae here to become an adult, that is, because remember what happens in this is that we've got male and female larvae. They will develop into adults. Those adults will mate and produce eggs inside the host. So this infection doesn't grow inside the host. For them to actually get more infected, they have to eat more infected larvae. That makes sense? So it's not like bacteria. It's not like a viral infection where they can expand inside the host. Although we have reproduction occurring within the host, that's just to get an egg out on pasture. So we've got the time that they ingest this L3 larvae to the time that you have an adult that is mated and passing eggs in the feces is approximately 14 to 21 days, and we refer to that as the pre-patent period of infection. So with that pre-patent period of infection, the things that we know about homunculus is a very, very potent blood feeder. That's what they do. They exsanguinate sheep. If you look at an animal that has a high load of homunculus, all of their tissue will be white. We had a ram that died out here at the farm just recently, completely white. 5 hours later, after death, was still bleeding. He didn't have any clotting factors in his blood. His blood was so diffused with extra protein that's been put into his blood to compensate for red blood cell loss that everything was white. You open up the ram, his heart was white, liver was pale. All these tissues that have blood were completely pale, and that's what homunculus does. So if we're going to combat this parasite, we know that there's issues with the dewormers that are out there. One of the first things that have gone into this is looking at the genetics of parasite-resistant hosts. So is parasite resistance an inherited trait? And the simple answer to that is yes. most disease-resistant phenotypes tend to have a measure of heritability. How is parasite resistance measured? Well, our best way of measuring parasite resistance is taking a fecal leg count. Not multiple, just one. And we've had tons of arguments about when does this fecal leg count occur. We find that the fecal leg count that is most informative over lifetime reduction in fecal leg count tends to be the fecal leg count when lambs are the most susceptible to parasites, which occurs during weaning. So we take that weaning fecal leg count, and that's how we've come up with this measurement of genetics. So what is the heritability then of parasite resistance? Well, depending on the study you look at, it varies between 0.01 and 0.5. So when animals that are tested have a larger parasitic load, the heritability of fecal leg count improves. So what this means is that an animal has to become infected before we know that they're parasite resistant, right? And you have to have variability within that population, which makes it difficult, especially if you're trying to measure that in weaned lambs in the fall, because they're not infected, right? So those kind of things come into play in the heritability of this. But in the Contol breed that have been using NSIP or National Sheep Improvement Program and Lamb Plan, the heritability estimates for fecal leg count EPDs is approaching 0.5. So to give some reference on that, muscling has heritability of 0.5. This has a higher heritability than growth. Growth in sheep has a heritability of approximately 0.35. So we have a highly heritable trait that should be very selective, right? So it indicates that parasite resistance has a large genetic component and should respond well to selection. So used appropriately, crossbreeding with parasite-resistant breeds should improve parasite resistance, right? Improvement within breed can be made, of course, but you gotta be able to identify those animals. And they may not be represented in your flock. And the animals that you're trying to bring in from other producers may not test for that. So improvement within breed can be done. Ask the Australians, they did this with merino sheep. 15 years of selection before you get really meaningful improvement in reduced fecal leg count. So what breeds do we consider parasite resistant in the U.S.? We've got typically 3 culprits: the St. Croix, the Gulf Coast Native, and Barbados Black Belt. Now, some of you folks in the audience may be thinking about, what about Katahdins? Well, think about where Katahdins were originated. Michael Peel and Charlie Brown in the great state of Maine had the idea in the 1950s to put together a hair breed that wouldn't require shearing, that would have maternal traits and terminal traits that would fit a future sheep market that wouldn't be as dependent on wool. Sounds really insane, right? These guys were looking into the future. The problem is the amount of heritage of these animals going into them is limited, right? So what we get with Katahdins is we don't see the amount of parasite resistance that we see in either Croix, Gulf Coast Natives, or in the Black Valley sheep. They lie somewhere in intermediate. Moreover, the Katahdins are about to become the #1 breed registry in the country, meaning that they are on the verge of surpassing Suffolk sheep in the United States as being the most popular breed in the United States. With that being said, we know that there's introduction because the Katahdin breed is at an open registry for a long period of time. So the Katahdins can be a variable mixed bag of parasite resistance. So when I think of parasite resistant sheep, these are the guys that I typically think of: the St. Croix, Gulf Coast Native, and Barbados Black Belt. One thing I do want to dispel while we're at this is that Dorper sheep, although they're hair sheep, are not parasite resistant. They're a train wreck in terms of parasite resistance, right? Where do they come from? They come from a Mediterranean climate to the deserts of South Africa. There's no rationale for why those sheep should have any parasite resistance, and other than the fact that they have hair. So hair on an animal or hair on sheep do not necessarily mean that those animals are parasite resistant. So what does parasite resistance really look like? In our system at WVU, what we can do is raise animals on this elevated floor barn. By doing that, the animals are parasite naive. The lambs are born on that floor. They're never exposed to a blade of grass in their life. They can't pick up homunculus from the floor of the barn. They can't get it from the hay or the feed trough or anything else. These lambs are walking around with zero fecal leg count all the time. To kill the naive lambs, there's no homunculus in their abdomens. Really, it's a nice experimental model. So what we've done with that is taken those St. Croix lambs and given them what we call a primary infection. So some of the naive lambs are given 10,000 homunculus contortus L3 larvae and allowed to persist for 7 weeks. So during a primary infection, those lambs peak at about 3,000 eggs per gram, and with no implemented treatment, no dewormers whatsoever, by week 5, and this is very consistent, by week 5 after infection, the fecal egg count is 0. And it stays up. Okay. So with the challenge infection, what this does is this represents the development of memory within those animals, or immunological memory. So what we do is we take those primary infected lambs, let them go for about 5 weeks during their infection, deworm everybody, both the suck lambs and the St. Croix lambs, so the fecal egg count is 0. The dewormer we use for this is levamisole. So we use levamisole, get them down at about 4 or 5 weeks, then we let them rest for 4 weeks. So what that does with their immune response is it allows it, when there's no kind of antigen there to develop antibody against, what they do is they start creating what are called memory cells. And those memory cells persist for a while, and then they start going down. As soon as those cells start to become depleted, then what we do is we reinfect them. And by reinfecting them, what we see in the challenge animals is that they never develop fecal in the St. Croix sheep. The first time they see it, they clear it by themselves. The second time, it's gone. So let's compare that to our common Suffolk crossbred lambs. The naive lambs, of course, never really have a fecal egg count. The primary infected lambs go up to 7,000. So let's look at the difference. They were given the same amount of larvae, exactly the same, 10,000 larvae. About 3,200 here in 4 weeks. At 4 weeks, they're about 7,000 eggs per gram. Okay, so you guys are pretty interested probably in this part here. What happened was, when the kids threw a bale of hay in the pen with those lambs and made everybody have diarrhea. When sheep have diarrhea, what does it do to fecal egg count? It dilutes it, right? Hey, so that's what happened. Here it is. Diluted fecal egg count. The next week, it's right back. Okay? So, nothing fancy, nothing really super important happening there other than change in diet causes diarrhea and ruminants. And that's something that we're all pretty familiar with. During the challenge infection, though, what we see in these Suffolk crossbred lambs is very similar to what we see in the primary infection of the St. Croix lambs, other than the fact that they don't clear the infection. So they'll stay at about 3,000, 4,000 eggs per gram pretty consistently. But really our focus in terms of immune response of these animals is looking at what is occurring during the early stages of infection. So in a study we did a couple years ago, we looked at 10 days after infection and how many larvae were actually reaching the abomasum or were present in the abomasum at the time of slaughter in those lambs. You see the wool lambs here, and this is a challenge infection. On average had 530 larvae in their abomasum. Hair lambs at 16. That's the difference. The hair lambs, the hair sheep, do not permit the establishment of adults in the animal. Therefore, there's no fecal egg count, right? They kick them out. They don't let them set up shop. The wool animals let the larvae set up shop, become adults, start to mate, and then create an immune response. But oftentimes in those animals, it's too late. So this is what we're doing with this parasite resistance work. And I wanted to share some interesting videos with you while we had you on this one. So you want to get on this one? Yeah, get that one right here. So just give me a moment before we start. What we've done here is we've taken cells, so this is blood cells from these naive wool animals. So this is the Suffolk crossbred animals. We've taken cells from those animals and exposed them to larvae. When we do this with the naive wool lambs, you see that some of the cells are binding to the tail of that larvae. So while they're trying to trap it down to this plate, look at how fast that guy's going. He's going crazy. These guys have no immunological memory. There's nothing going on, right? And still, we get very little adherence or activity of cells onto those larvae. I'm going to go to the next video here. This is with the naive St. Croix sheep. You can't see it because all of this entire parasite is coated with cells. This is the first time that animal has seen the larvae. And you can see what's going on there. With the infected wool animals, let's go to the ones left first. There you go. in the motility of those larvae, but they only tend to bind around one spot on that parasite. If we go to the infected hair lambs here, well, this one's dead, this one's dying, and this one is completely covered with those larvae. So if I haven't convinced you yet, these sheep are pretty parasite resistant, right? Now, who wants to incorporate them in their flock? Let me give you some ideas, right? Mature weight on the ewes, a whopping 110 pounds, right? When I kill these lambs at market, their market weight is probably about 50, 55, maybe 60 pounds. Dressing percent is less than 40%. So I'm hanging 25-pound carcasses on these lambs. Ribeye area, maybe the size of two of my fingers put together, right? Not a lot of value in terms of carcass acceptability and what we're really looking for in these animals. So another project that we did that we kind of stumbled on by accident was using a group of Dorset Texel crossbred sheep from a producer in southwestern Pennsylvania. So I brought in these ewes, and I thought they would have enough Dorset to dilute any of the effects that any Texel breeding might have. And there's some data coming out of the UK that suggests that Texel sheep have a fair amount of parasite resistance. So here's what happens. Now, we didn't compare these. These are three studies that kind of happen simultaneously. Same amount of worms that are going on here. Dorset Texel crossbred animals are in this dark spotted line here. St. Croix are in this small dotted line. Suffolk's in the solid line here. This is a primary infection. So during that primary infection, we see that the Suffolk do what they always do. They get infected, and their fecal egg count goes up to about 12,000 eggs per gram at 35 days post-infection. We look at the St. Croix, they do the same thing. 5 weeks after infection, they're right back down to zero. But look at these guys. We've got the Dorset Texel lambs that delay the onset of fecal egg count from even the St. Croix, but they don't necessarily clear the infection. They keep it about 2,000 eggs per gram. And that's during a primary infection. So you think about Texel sheep are very kind of round and short and quick in their kind, but also have a lot of muscle shape to them. So they're desirable as a terminal sire in this particular case, or at least that's what we're thinking with this. We do this during a challenge infection. Same thing happens with the Suffolk sheep in this black line. They go up to 8,000, they'll trickle down here to about 4,000 and stay there pretty consistent. The hair sheep, in this case, popped up at day 28 to about 800 eggs per gram, and then went right back down to zero. So you guys are okay with that? I'm okay with the sheep walking around with 800 eggs per gram. Really not going to concern them too much. And then the Dorset Texel crossbred animals here, we've got them having a delay in their fecal egg count, and they're keeping about 1,000 eggs per gram. That's what they were doing the whole time. So it's pretty interesting when we start looking at that. If we look at the number of worms that are in these animals in their gut after this 49 days of infection, the Dorset Texel during a primary infection, we're sitting close to about 400 worms in the abomasum. During the challenge infection, that's almost cut in half down to just a little bit north of 200. But if you look at the Suffolk animals at day 10, they're well over 500. So there is some advantage to using Texels or using, and remember that this is not 100% Texel in this flock. This is only 50%. So we can use perhaps Texels as a terminal sire while maintaining some parasite resistance in the progeny. The question becomes how much Texel is needed, right? We were getting away with it at 50%. Can you get away with it at 25%? And those kind of things we don't really know. But we can certainly consider crossbreeding as an implement in these cases. Now remember, there's some issues that are going on with all of this fancy research that we do at the White Tower here in Morgantown, right? There's a lot of things that we forget about. St. Croix sheep are great, but they are a disaster when it comes to the carcass. They don't have those carcasses that are going to be acceptable on a commercial market. Texel sheep are great, but do you have them? Do they have parasite resistance? Where are you going to get them? Are they going to fit into your particular breeding program? And remember that we're using this fancy barn here that has an elevated floor. There's only single or double infections. They're not out grazing. They're not out doing what your sheep are doing at home every day, and that's taking mouthfuls of larvae. So there's some things that you have to take with a grain of salt coming from this research here in Morgantown, is that these grazing animals will be exposed to constant reinfection. They're not have these single infection time points that we do in this basic research. So we almost have to consider a threshold of resilience. And I mean, you throw out this term resilience, and you probably heard it quite a bit. I think resilience is a hoax, right? If an animal is resilient, all that means is that they are, as soon as they're going to get stressed, they're going to be the first ones to die, right? So instead of selecting for, I really think that you either have resistant animals or not resistant animals, right? So then we get into this area of tolerance, right? So we start talking about tolerance of animals to do this. I think that there's also some things that we can do on farm to help with parasitism on these pastures. Grazing management, selective deworming, or fumacia, and also the nutrition of the animals can have a large impact on this. So when I first got here to WVU, one of the guys working over in plant science and grazing out on the organic farms was talking to me about a project that they were doing. Now they were trying to supplement lambs on pastures with a corn barley mix, right? And they were doing this kind of extraordinarily labor-intensive grazing program, which is called avoidance grazing. So basically, the sheep are grazed on paddocks for 1 to 3 days. This paddock is no bigger than this section of the room, right? With electronet fix. It has that water trough, shade, and then a bucket for some feed on those animals. And there's 6 of them, and they have to move them on a daily basis, right? Who's got time to do that? My graduate students do, right? So those are the ones who are doing it. So we've got graduate students and undergraduate students that always need time to fill in during the day. So what we do is we graze those paddocks for about 1 to 3 days, minimum rest period of 56 days. Now, if they graze in April, they are not coming back until June or July. Yeah, you're shaking your head right there. What's going to happen to pasture quality? It's going to grow out of the pasture. So it's going to require some intermittent mowing to maintain pasture quality, or some thought about how that's going to do. And it's extremely labor intensive. But nonetheless, we're going to term this WVU style grazing, where we employ a lot of students, a lot of free labor, and we'll do it. Okay, so what we did in this first study, and when they started the organic farm and plant science, they had the idea of using merino sheep in this particular group of animals because they were going to sell organic wool. And it didn't, it kind of backfired on them because all the parasites that were out there trying to kill most of those merino sheep, right? So we started using some more Suffolk and Dorset. So we ended up with this hodgepodge of Suffolk, merino, Dorset crossbred animals. We used 52 wean lambs in this first study. We've got a control treatment where they're not fed anything, just allowed to graze in pastures. We've got some lambs that are dewormed at weaning with moxidectin, and that's it, right? So there's one deworming at weaning. We've got a group of lambs that were supplemented with corn barley at 1% of body weight, and then we've got a group that had deworming and supplementation together. Now, a lot of this stuff you would say, come on, when you deworm and supplement lambs that are grazing on pasture, we can do that for 30 years, right? Everything is new and organic, right? Because these guys haven't grown any livestock for a while. So we're going to look at what happens when we did this. Well, guess what? When the lambs that were dewormed and fed grain, well, they grew pretty well. Lambs that were dewormed grew pretty well. And the lambs that were just given grain alone, and this is just corn barley, grew fairly poorly and had a fairly large feed weight. Not necessarily surprising. So they came running down to my office when I first started there and said, hey, when you supplement lambs that are grazing on pasture, it doesn't have any effect on feed weight. I said, well, you didn't have any protein in it. So you look at the crude protein that's being given to these lambs, it's 10% between that corn barley mix. That's what's being offered in that supplement. I said, bump up the supplement to 16% and do the same thing, and let's see what happens. So what we did next year is use soybean meal and corn at 16% crude protein. Same treatments, controlled, dewormed, supplemented, and dewormed plus supplementation. Still the same body weight going on there.
You're working on that. Why did the control have a better daily gain than the
Yeah, that's a good one, right? So this is what happened. The guy that was running the experiment wanted to control lambs to do to put them on. Sometimes he was inefficient putting them on that pastures. He was trying to get us in trouble. But the pasture quality is pretty good. Right? Okay, so this is what happens when we increase the crude protein, right? Total gain. So now we've got that guy away from controllable land breeding, and now we're back down here. So total gain there is bottomed out. D1 lambs gained about 1.1 kilograms. The grain-fed lambs 1.9, and D1 plus grain 4.2. Right. This is the interesting part. So if you look at the gain between these two animals, statistically it's not different. Then you look at the fecal egg count, and you've got to drive a truck through difference between that two. So these lambs here, that were dewormed, had a low fecal egg count. These guys got more than twice the fecal egg count, but gained equivalent. So what we're seeing with this is that supplementation with protein may not be affecting the parasite load, but be able to increase host nutrition so they can deal with parasitism. What these parasites do is create a hypoproteinemic situation within the animal. So the protein requirements of a grazing lamb are different than the protein requirements of a lamb that's in feedlot, because they're losing protein due to parasitism. We repeated this in another year, make sure that we saw the same things, and that's what we did, right? Equivalent gain here, we come down here, and these lambs, fecal egg count 91, fecal egg count 227.
This is gain for what period, Scott?
Oh, this is horrible, right? So this is over 12 weeks.
12 weeks.
So don't get excited about this. What is this, 2 kilograms in 12 weeks? What's that, 4 pounds in 12 weeks? Not burning up the barn by any stretch of the imagination, right? Attribute this to a little bit of the type of the animals that are out there. We're talking about weaning weights of 30 pounds, right? So that's 90-day weaning weights. Okay. All right, so what happens when you graze lambs like this, right? And increase the protein. So we take the average daily gain, it's equivalent between these two groups. We, of course, expect this a little bit lower here in the control. The Fomatra score is no different between these two groups, right? And then the fecal egg count, of course, is different. So if the fecal egg count is different, but the Fomatra score is not, what the protein then is doing is supplementing, right, for the hyperproteinemic condition caused by the blood-feeding parasites. So, again, protein supplementation have effect on this with this WBU style grazing with different sources of protein. So what we wanted to do, there's a lot of data in the literature that look at rumen bypass protein and the effect of rumen bypass. So this is protein that's not degraded in the rumen, that is protected, and then is absorbed in the small intestine. So what we did in this case, right, is we used both rumen degradable protein. So in this case, this is plant-derived rumen degradable protein in the form of alfalfa pellets, and then rumen bypass protein. So there's no degradation in the rumen, and most of the absorption occurs in the small intestine, and our source of rumen bypass protein is fish meal. And our question was, by adding this, is this going to affect fecal egg count and growth? There's a lot of data that show that giving rumen bypass or providing rumen bypass protein to diet and feedlot steers and feedlot lambs improves growth and also can affect FEC and what we've seen in some lamb diets. So the diets were formulated to be 19% crude protein. Alfalfa pellets typically have about 70% rumen degradable and 30% rumen bypass protein. Corn soybean meal is about 60% degradable, 40% bypass. And then this corn soybean meal and fish meal combination gave us a diet that's about 30% rumen degradable and 70% rumen bypass. We look at this, the average Fomatra scored no difference between any of these lambs during the grazing period. The gain, the total gain. So remember last time we were looking at gains of 4 in the dewormed and treated groups, right? Now we're just looking at supplementation. These lambs in these alfalfa pellet groups, and this only for 4 weeks, right? 4 kilos, about 8 pounds. These guys up here about 5 kilos. These guys are about 7.5 kilos. So big difference in gain. Then we come down here to change in Fomatra score from day 0 to day 42. This includes a transition period to these diets. We've got the corn, soy, fish meal group having the largest change, meaning that they're numerically reducing their Fomatra score closer to 1, which would be a more ideal Fomatra score. And then strongyl eggs per gram, we can see that the alfalfa pellet group in this case also had low fecal egg count and just as low as the fish meal group. But the corn soybean group was higher than both. A lot of interesting questions that come about from this, right? So, can we get away with alfalfa pellet administration on this one to provide that extra protein that's needed and reduce the fecal egg count? Well, I don't know, right? That's a tough one. But what we're really interested in is looking at this fish meal and having that mower right there. Because we had to get more alfalfa pellets fed to those lambs to get them up to 19% crude protein on average, we can look at cost per kilogram of gain. We can see that corn, soy, and fish meal had the lowest cost per kilogram of gain, largely due to the fact that they were growing better. So fish meal is a mess to deal with from a producer standpoint, right? And we were feeding this in an organic farm. It was a natural-based fish meal. There is no organic fish meal, right? So it was the fish meal with the least amount of preservative in it. When you think about that, boy, fish meal, when it's hot and humid outside, it gets in the air in there, it's going to go rancid off and quick. So I think we do this. The students kept those buckets with sealed lids all the time, and they'd certainly let me know if that fish meal got a little spoilage on it. In addition to having a lot of rumen bypass protein, fish meal also has a lot of oil in it. So we've set up experiments subsequent to this to look at the oil effect of fish meal by taking fish oil and adding it to corn soybean meal. No effect on fecal weight count, right? At the same, pretty much the same fecal weight count as the lambs with soybean meal alone. So what that indicates is that it is that bypass, or at least a protein source that's in the fish meal. And this fecal weight count caused by higher oil, and I think that we've addressed those questions in some of these subsequent experiments. So to kind of wrap all of this stuff, one of the first things that we're going to talk about in terms of managing parasites is it's not one thing anymore, right? We used to be able to rely on drugs, switch to breeds. It's everything. It has to be a key component of management. So is going hair the right option for you? Are there alternatives? Can you use some of these breeds that we talked about to use as terminal sires? So you maintain the nucleus flock of purebred cotogenous, for example, and then use tetrasires for your terminal project, right? So breed is a consideration. Is WVU style grazing right for you? Certainly isn't for me, right? As a former farm manager, and I help my folks out in California manage their flock. Boy, I can't see my dad out there moving fences. It's just not going to happen, right? So, are there pieces of this that can work? And I think the answer is yes, and we've got some projects designed this year to kind of get at this pasture management standpoint. Nutrition. A lot of these folks, and we live in an area that has grass. Every time that we have grass, my parents in California don't have grass, right? So, summertime, they have got to load their pastures with water to make sure they have any grass, and the cost of putting water on pasture is extreme for them this time of year, especially with the drought that's going on out west. Conversely here, if you're going to put those lambs on that free forage resource, is adding any kind of supplementation worth it? Is the gain and any kind of accelerated gain that you see with those lambs, is it going to be worth it? Do you have the time to really do that? Famacha, right? So I kind of skipped over this, and if you're not familiar with this, this is a method of scoring the color of the lower eyelid in sheep that was developed by Mullen. So it's Mullen's chart. That's Famacha. That's the origin of that name. And it's a way of selectively deworming. Are you using it? If you've got 200, 300, 400 ewes, this is pretty labor intensive, and you've got to do it a couple times over the summertime. Well, let me tell you the story with this. I was in Mexico last summer at a conference, and I had the opportunity to have dinner with some Australian producers. One guy said, I have 50,000 sheep. So what do I do with Famacha? You got your money. I don't have time for that. So it makes it difficult. But then the guy sitting next to him said, we made one of these producers do Famacha. One of these guys has got 40, 50,000 head sheep out there. He did it on 10,000 of his ewes for 8 years. His fecal egg count reduction for a 3-way implemented, that is ivermectin, benzimidazoles, and levamisole, had all 3 of them together, was 30% fecal egg count reduction on average in his flock. Did that for 8 years, did Famacha for 8 years. That 30% went to 80%. Famacha works, but you got to be willing to put in the time on this. We really don't have the drug resistance issues. They're there, they're prevalent. And believe me, I've seen animals die from worms, but we don't have it nearly as bad as those guys in Australia and New Zealand, where Zolvex doesn't work. A brand new monopantol drug that just came out a few years ago, that is no longer effective. So what do you do with that if you're going to use Famacha? And so it's got to take a little bit of everything with that. So acknowledge some folks here. I've had a slew of graduate students come through my lab in the last few years. Jessica, Rush, Rebecca, Karen, Rush and Rebecca are both at vet schools. Rush is at Virginia Tech and Rebecca's down in Mississippi. Current students are Elizabeth Shepard and Krista Taylor and Jessica Jacobs. I just brought in a postdoc from Louisiana State University that's going to help us continue this work out a little bit. A lot of this legwork and everything else is done by our undergraduates that come through the lab transiently. The ones that stay around are listed here. The longer list are the ones that have left. Largely do a lot of the grazing projects. I got collaborators down at both LSU and Virginia Tech, and have been funded by various USDA grants and private industry support. So with all of that, happy to answer any questions you folks may have. Yes, sir.
What about working problems with the text along, say, the cotton or the sync?
I'll let you know. So what we've got set up to do this year is we've got a group of ewes that came from Virginia Tech, a flock of Katahdin ewes. A third of them were bred to Texas sires, a third were bred to Suffolk sires, a third are straight bred Katahdin. We'll bring all those lambs up here. We're going to do a thorough evaluation of using Texas as terminal sires. Now, George Weary up in southwest PA and Marion, Pennsylvania, we didn't have much of an issue with it. But lambs out of season pretty consistently. Has been working with us quite a bit on managing that breeding program.
I have another question.
Yes.
Okay. What about other sources of bypass protein,
So Sericea, so that's going to set up a different type of bypass protein system with tannins binding protein and going through. So the thing that we have to be careful about with tannin feeding, right? You have too much tannin, you're going to create the same situation the worm was created, right? So we're actually looking at, we're setting up some projects this year to look at the source of bypass protein, and we have different amounts of bypass protein at different infection levels. So that's one thing that we're doing, and also looking at sources, blood meal, bone meal, corn gluten feed, and then comparing all that back to soybean meal to see how the amino acid profile of these, if there's any difference in those profiles. Because fish meal can be a variable mixed bag of amino acid composition, right? So what is going through there? There's some papers that have come out recently that show that parasite-resistant sheep preferentially mobilize free amino acid from their abomasum to immune tissues, spleen, local lymph nodes, right? To assist an immune response. So there's a lot of, there's a really nice intersection between nutrition and immunology that we're looking to explore. Right. You had a question before.
Yeah. How does all this information first come to like, I have a smaller, kind of increasing size, and I bought some does, and I've had some issues with them where my other does I haven't had really had any problem. So I'm thinking, when you're talking about, checking people that count on kids, how would I use that then to pick my does that I want to take for replacement? The one with higher egg counts, the one with lower?
So you're looking at using fecal egg count as a selection methodology for your,
As part of, yeah.
okay, as part of your thing. So if you're gonna do an 8-week fecal egg count, you're gonna look at things that have low fecal egg counts, right? I mean, that's ideal. So I tell you what, my dad's always told me when I've heard from a lot of the old sheep guys is that you buy in most of your problems, right? So you usually pay a lot of money for foot rot, and actually we tend to get foot rot for free from Virginia Tech. They nothing but some plenty of foot rot. So you buy in a lot of these problems, and it's your introduction of new animals to your flock and how you manage that, right? And I think that's got to be a consideration. With goat population, it gets difficult, right? So there is some documented resistance of Kegos. A lot of people are using Kego 4 process. I don't know what.
Well, the ones I bought actually are, getting down to the 4 process.
Right.
That's the one that I was
All right. So this is not new information I've heard. It's just like people that call me up and say, I bought all these Katahdins and now they're dying from parasites. No. They're supposed to be resistant. The Kego resistance is about the same thing with Katahdins. It's a mixed bag of variability. And what you guys have an advantage of, especially in the goat herd, there's a group out of Kentucky State University that is measuring fecal egg count in kids and in goats. And they are using that to develop what's called expected progeny differences to predict the passage of that particular trait to their offspring. So if you want to talk to me afterwards, I can get you in touch with Dr. Andrews at Kentucky State. And he's really setting that and promoting a lot of producers in that southeast central part of the United States to do this. And they're doing a really good job of that. Getting enrolled in any of these genetic evaluation programs can help a lot, not only with that, but also with a lot of other traits.
And is this for, I know what general means, is this what we call the barber pole?
You got it. All day long. That's a barber pole. Yes, sir.
It talks about physiological memory.
Yeah.
If you're working with lambs, you have to boost that physiological memory without, you stop that spike and then they come back down. And even with that spike, you have that because of the parasites.
Typically what we see, right, when you get a cold, you get the cold, it gets really bad, right, and then it goes away. As that's going away, you're building that immunological memory. Those memory cells are produced such that when you get exposed to that same strain of that virus again, you have protection against that. Same kind of thought as a vaccination, right? Vaccination works off the principle of immunological memory. The problem with memory, the problem with dosing animals to vaccinate them is that the variable amount of antigen that's presented by both larvae and adults is all over the board. So what memory are you creating? Are you creating larval memory or are you creating adult memory? And that's what a lot of vaccines have had trouble dealing with, is where do you make the vaccine towards? Is it a larval component or an adult component? So the current vaccine that's out called Bowdridge, that's available in Australia, 5 doses of vaccine to those lambs, right? To get effective protection, and you got to do it anyway. So it is a horrible vaccine, but it works, right? Scientifically, it works. Reduces fecal-like those animals. When you have a grazing animal on pasture, what we say is that the first exposure of the year is the one that the ewes really need to develop, to regain immunity to that, because they tend to lose it on an annual basis because the antigen variability is so large. Right? But what we're looking at is in these St. Croix sheep, the immune response is really targeted towards the larval stage that can pinpoint what we develop vaccines towards. So your memory throughout the year is developed early within the grazing season in the ewes, and the lambs it takes a while, right? Because the immune system in lambs is a train wreck until they get to about five months of age. It's all over the place, right? Because the immune system in lambs has to be tolerant of developing rumen microflora and not respond to it. So you got this lamb that's trying to grow and develop an immune system, but it also has to be tolerant of everything that's going on in the gut. That's a great question. Did I answer it for you?
Yeah.
Okay. It's complex. I teach a veterinary immunology class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so we're happy to come by. Anything else? Yes. I'll go with you, Lincoln, back. Yeah.
How did you feed lambs on pasture?
How did I feed them?
What's the procedure or the mechanism?
Girls went out in the morning, fed them 0.5% of body weight in the morning.
On ground?
No, in the feed troughs. They don't
Feed
feed
trough?
on that.
You do those troughs every day?
The troughs, the girls, if you balance them right, it's just like carrying water buckets, right? 2 water buckets are easier carried than 1. So that's why I always told them. I said 2 feed troughs are easier carried than 1, right? So you can put them on the works and put them on. We did all right. Yes, ma'am.
And what's the chance of bringing in worms on that, like you said, just for grazing?
It's not going to happen.
They
So
won't survive.
here's what happens, right? The worms, so these larvae that are on pasture have this really interesting way of survival. They've got a sheath around them. And that sheath does is allows for them to maintain moisture, right? So if it gets dry, that sheath kind of closes up a little bit on the end and doesn't allow as much exchange of oxygen or water going in and out of it, right? And when it's moist, it opens up and allows free exchange of fluid going through it. So it helps maintain osmotic pressure. If it's dry, there's only so much that sheath can do. So desiccation is the best way to kill a parasite. Taking a hay cutting off the field is the best way to do that. Let's not graze all the way down to the ground.
What about round tag?
What about route hay?
Yeah, because it's wet.
It's wet, right? And what else is going on in route hay? Fermentation and everything else. So there's a lot of other issues going on with that route hay that are going to take care of it.
And then the worms infect sheep and goats,
Yes.
and they go to cattle or vice versa, or?
In some cases, right? So in some cases, it is, you can see Homunculus contortus can be in cattle. You go down to the southeastern United States, it's not uncommon to find cattle herds with homunculus. Typically, the species of homunculus that affects cattle more than homunculus, or more than contortus, is what's called Homunculus classii. And Homunculus classii is the one that affects cattle a little bit more. Ostratagia tends to be cattle specific, and we have a form of ostratagia that we used to call ostratagia in sheep. It's now called telomersacea. It affects the abomasum, does the exact same thing in the abomasum that ostratagia does in cattle. So there can be a little trade-off, but here's the great thing. Cattle tend to chew up parasites and spit them out, especially calves, right? They're really good, for whatever reason, we all know that she can find a way to kill themselves, right? I don't care if it's a parasite, like, you know, we flood irrigate out in California, so if you pull the ditch too deep, the sheep will lay in the ditch in the summertime and get turtled and die because they turned upside down in the ditch, right? So they'll find a way to do it. Cattle are quite a bit more resilient to this. So what we see in cattle and grazing cattle, and the way we used to do this out in Virginia is a hay cutting and cattle grazing a pasture. We can consider that pasture fairly clean before sheep go out.
About time, you got 56 days on that.
Yeah, the WVU style grazing.
What studies are done on that?
About rest period and timing.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff on rest period, especially from the agronomy side, right? So the rest period is going to affect the quality of grass that's coming back on there, right? And
I mean, the parasite.
on the parasite load, 56 days not going to do anything. Those parasites are going to be out there all summer. I can take a parasite, I can take these larvae and take them down to -8, right, degrees Celsius. Bring them back, and I'll still get some movement. So they overwinter. Frost and freeze does not kill them. Otherwise, you know, and they also overwinter in the animals. So it's not a complete freezing kind of thing that'll get rid of them. Yes.
So our NRCS guy was just telling me that it's a combination between the freezing and the summer heat, so he was recommending that I should save one pasture and let it run super hot and super cold cycle. And I could bring
With the hay
cattle in
cutting?
there. I could bring cattle in there.
That's the ticket right there.
Instead of sheep to keep it good.
That's right.
Um,
Because you don't have any reinfection that's going on. So what the principle that's going on behind that,
or maybe
well, it's lessened, right? So I didn't say it doesn't completely kill everything. It lessens a little bit around the pasture, but you don't have anything stopping the pasture, right? So if you lessen that, you go through a heat, take a hay cut and graze cattle, you are preventing the ability of that worm. You are reducing its ability to survive, right? Then you put sheep back on there and you load it back up. So those are good principles and solid management principles to deal with this in addition to everything else. Take one more question.
I've been doing some reading about the goats, giving them a calf, copper bolus, before you worm them, and then worm them, because I know sheep you can't take them. But they say that really helps.
There's been a ton of study out of Louisiana and Arkansas and Georgia about the use of copper oxide wire particles. And they're called Copassure boluses, and they're available for use. There's 2 and 4 gram boluses. Copassure is only effective against ammonia.
Now, I did that procedure with mine. Susan Cheney and I did a peak weight reduction study
Yep.
on our sheep and goats. And that was one of our groups was copper bolus only.
Did it
No
work?
other treatment. Yes, it worked. Very effective on kids. And I run my sheep and goats together because it works better for me management wise. All of the goats get copper bolus. Then I run sheep mineral, so I don't have to run sheep get copper. But we actually didn't use the Copshore because it hadn't come out yet in the small bowls. So we had to make our own capsules based on whether we wanted 2 gram or 4 gram. But we found it to be very effective. It doesn't totally eliminate, but with goats are so susceptible that if you can
what we use as the standard. So I've got there's a pharmacist out in Oklahoma that compounds that for us because it's hard to get a hold of sometimes. So we buy it by the kilo. And I'm serious. That was a fun, you know, I had to buy some drugs by the kilo with the university credit card.
Well, it was WVU.
That's
Okay.
right.
Okay, Scott's going to be around. You can ask him questions later. And let's give him a round of applause for his presentation.